Why France is losing control of Africa, the hidden war. For over 60 years, an empire hid in plain sight in Africa. It didn't have an official name, and it wasn't governed by decrees from Paris. It was run through a shadowy network of secret deals, presidential favors, and quiet military threats. In the corridors of power, they had a name for it: Françafrique. The whole point was to make sure that even after France's colonial flags came down, its economic and political control would never really leave. It was the empire that was never supposed to die. Today, that empire is collapsing. And it's not collapsing quietly. It's being torn down, country by country, by a new generation of Africans who are sick of the hidden war France fought to keep its grip. From the capitals of the Sahel to the halls of the African Union, a revolution is brewing. This is the story of that hidden war, a war over money, resources, soldiers, and spies, and the story of why, after decades of dominance, France is finally and decisively losing control of Africa. On the surface, the story of France and Africa was sold as a partnership. A tale of shared language, culture, and security. But underneath that carefully polished veneer was a much darker truth. The truth was economic puppetry, with African nations tied to a currency they couldn't control. It was a reality of military interventions that weren't about protecting people, but about protecting French-friendly regimes. And it was a system of resource extraction on an epic scale, where the wealth of Africa powered French cities while leaving countries like Niger in the dark. This system, Françafrique, was a masterpiece of neo-colonial design. For decades, it worked like a charm, keeping a huge chunk of a continent tethered to Paris. But now, the secrets are out. The deals are being exposed. And the anger that's been simmering for generations has finally boiled over. Across West Africa, French flags are being burned, ambassadors are being kicked out, and military bases that stood for half a century are being unceremoniously shut down. This isn't just a diplomatic squabble. This is the front line of a hidden war for the future of a continent, a war that France is losing badly. The question is, why now? What finally broke the system? And how was this whole web of control built in the first place? To understand the collapse, you first have to understand the architecture of the empire that refused to die. To get your head around the sheer scale of France's meltdown in Africa, you need to understand the system that held it all together. This wasn't old-school colonialism with governors and direct rule. It was something way more sophisticated, more sinister, and for a long time, much harder to shake. It was Françafrique, a term that perfectly captures the tangled, corrupt, and deeply personal web of connections that tied France to its former African colonies long after they got their independence, in the 1960s. This wasn't an institution you could find on a map. It was a fog of influence, cooked up in the early days by Jacques Foccart, Charles de Gaulle's top Africa advisor. Foccart was the architect of this new world order, a system built on three powerful pillars, each designed to make sure African sovereignty was always second to French interests. The first and most powerful pillar was economic control, and its main weapon was the CFA franc. Created back in 1945, the franc of the French colonies of Africa was spun as a gift of stability. In reality, it was a financial straitjacket. 14 African nations were required to use it. For decades, the deal forced these countries to deposit 50% of their foreign currency reserves into a special account controlled by the French Treasury. A 2019 reform for the West African CFA franc supposedly ended that requirement, but the change is still dragging, and the core of the system is intact. The currency is still pegged to the euro, with France guaranteeing its value. A guarantee sounds nice, but the cost is brutal. It means the economic policy for these 14 nations isn't decided in Dakar or Yaoundé. It's effectively set in Frankfurt by the European Central Bank, by way of Paris. They can't devalue their currency to boost exports. They can't fight local recessions with monetary tools. They're just passengers in a car being driven from Europe. Critics have rightly called it out for what it is: a system that strangles economic development and monetary sovereignty, all while making sure French companies have zero currency risk. It was economic puppetry, plain and simple, designed to keep the money flowing back to Paris. The second pillar was military dominance. When France granted independence, it came with strings attached, usually secret defense pacts. On paper, they looked like standard mutual defense treaties. In reality, they often had hidden clauses giving France the right to intervene militarily, not just to fight off foreign invaders, but to protect its business interests and, most importantly, to install or overthrow African leaders. This pillar turned France into the kingmaker of Francophone Africa. Leaders who toed the line, protected French assets, and voted with France at the UN, knew that French paratroopers would have their back if things got dicey at home. Guys like Omar Bongo in Gabon, who ruled for 41 years, or Idriss Déby in Chad, who held on for 30, owed their long careers to their loyalty to Paris. On the flip side, leaders who got out of line often found themselves facing sudden instability or a full-blown coup. This constant threat created a political class that answered more to the Élysée palace than to its own people. It was managed sovereignty, with French military bases scattered across the continent as a permanent reminder of who was really in charge. The third, and maybe most shameless pillar, was preferential access to strategic resources. This was the real prize. The economic and military pillars were just there to secure it. Françafrique made sure French companies got first dibs, and often a total monopoly, on Africa's incredible natural wealth. Oil from Gabon, cocoa from Ivory Coast, and the crown jewel, uranium from Niger. Niger is the most glaring example of this hidden war for resources. For over 50 years, the French state-controlled nuclear giant, Orano, formerly Areva, has been digging up uranium from the Nigerian desert. This isn't just any rock, it's the lifeblood of France's energy independence. It powers the nuclear reactors that provide about 70% of France's electricity, a cornerstone of its entire economy. But while France was lit up by Nigerian uranium, Niger itself remained one of the poorest places on Earth. For decades, lopsided deals meant the vast majority of profits flowed straight to France, leaving Niger with crumbs. This was the ugly secret at the heart of Françafrique, a system built to systematically siphon wealth from Africa to France, all hidden behind the language of partnership. These three pillars, economic chains, military muscle, and resource theft, created an empire that was mostly invisible to the outside world. It was a self-feeding loop. French guns protected friendly dictators, who in turn guaranteed French access to their nation's money and resources. For more than half a century, it was the bedrock of France's global power. But even the deepest foundations can crack. And as the 21st century rolled on, a few powerful tremors started to shake the whole rotten structure apart. For 60 years, the Françafrique machine seemed unstoppable. Then, in the early 2020s, it started to crack, and then shatter, with shocking speed. This wasn't random. It was a perfect storm of military failure, new global competition, and a massive demographic shift that the old guard in Paris completely failed to see coming. The first major catalyst was the spectacular failure of France's flagship military operation, Barkhane. Launched in 2014 to stop the spread of jihadist groups across the Sahel, Barkhane was supposed to be the modern proof of France's role as Africa's policeman. Its predecessor, Operation Serval, had been praised in 2013 for stopping militants from taking Mali's capital, Bamako. But that victory was a mirage. A decade of French boots on the ground didn't bring peace. In fact, the security situation got catastrophically worse. Under Barkhane, the violence didn't shrink, it spread like a cancer. Armed attacks soared, civilian deaths skyrocketed, and millions were forced from their homes in Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger. The French military, with its fancy jets and special forces, was good at hunting insurgents in the desert, but it was useless at fixing the real problems: corrupt governments, poverty, and local conflicts. Soon, French soldiers weren't seen as protectors anymore. They were seen as an occupying force, propping up failed governments that couldn't even keep their own people safe. This was fatal. France's main excuse for being there, security, was falling apart for everyone to see. The failure of Barkhane created a massive credibility gap, and it kicked the door wide open for new players to make a different offer. Stepping right into that gap were new global powers, especially Russia and China, who showed up without any colonial baggage. They were the second major catalyst. Russia***, mainly through its Wagner Group mercenaries, now called the Africa Corps, made a brutally simple offer to the new military juntas in the Sahel: "We'll provide security, no questions asked." While France demanded things like democratic reforms and human rights, Russia offered soldiers, weapons, and battlefield support in exchange for cash and, more importantly, mining concessions for things like gold and diamonds. Their methods were savage, but for regimes fighting for their lives, they looked effective. On top of that, Russia launched a masterful disinformation campaign, fanning the flames of existing anti-French anger online and painting itself as a liberator from neo-colonialism. It was a direct attack on France's story, and it worked. China, meanwhile, showed up as the indispensable economic alternative. While France's power was stuck in the past, China offered a partnership based on building things. Through its massive Belt and Road Initiative, Beijing has been pouring billions into African infrastructure, ports, railways, highways, and telecom networks. China offers African leaders rapid development with no lectures on democracy. They see a partner that builds and invests on a scale France can't even dream of anymore. The new airport in Senegal, the railway in Nigeria, the ports up and down the coast, many are stamped with Chinese cash and engineering. The arrival of Russia, China, and other players like Turkey and the Gulf states shattered the French monopoly. For the first time since the 1960s, African nations had real choices. They could pick their security partners and their economic allies. The world was no longer a one-way street leading to Paris. The exclusive club of Françafrique couldn't survive in this new global marketplace. The final, and maybe most powerful, catalyst was a demographic and technological tidal wave. Africa is the world's youngest continent, with over 60% of its population under 25. This is a generation with zero nostalgia for the colonial era. They weren't alive for independence and feel no gratitude towards France. What they see is a legacy of exploitation and a system that has failed them. And critically, this generation has the world in their pocket. Unlike their parents, who got their news from state-run media that was often pro-French, young Africans get their information from TikTok, X, and Facebook. These platforms have become digital battlefields where Pan-African influencers and citizen journalists expose the raw deal of the post-colonial order every single day. Speeches by defiant new leaders like Captain Ibrahim Traore of Burkina Faso go viral, spreading a message of sovereignty and resistance to millions. They share memes mocking French President Emmanuel Macron, they document anti-French protests in real time, and they debate the toxic legacy of the CFA Franc in online forums. This digital awakening created a powerful new Pan-African consciousness, one that is fiercely critical of France and its perceived arrogance. This toxic cocktail: military failure, new global rivals, and a young, connected, and angry generation, created the perfect conditions for a rebellion. The pillars of Françafrique, once thought to be made of stone, were suddenly exposed as hollow. All it took was a spark to bring the whole thing crashing down. And that spark came from a series of military coups that would, one by one, dismantle the hidden empire. The collapse didn't happen overnight. It was a chain reaction, a cascade of falling dominoes that started in the Sahel and spread with stunning speed. Each piece that fell just made the next one more likely to topple, creating a momentum that blew past the point of no return for French influence. The first domino was Mali. In August 2020, with massive protests against the corrupt government that couldn't stop the jihadist insurgency, the military, led by Colonel Assimi Goïta, took over. At first, Paris tried to play its old game, pushing for a quick return to civilian rule. But a second coup in May 2021 cemented the military's power and signaled a total break. The new junta in Bamako went all in on nationalism and started openly attacking France. They knew that popular anger with the French military was a powerful source of legitimacy. So, the Malian government started tearing down the pillars of Françafrique. They accused the French army of spying, a shocking flip of the official script. They kicked out the French ambassador, a huge act of defiance. Then they ordered all 5,100 French troops from Operation Barkhane to pack their bags and leave, ending a decade-long military presence. To fill the security void, Mali turned to Russia, welcoming hundreds of Wagner mercenaries. And in a final, symbolic gut punch, Mali dropped French as an official language, cutting a core cultural tie that had existed since 1960. Mali hadn't just stood up to France. It had written the playbook on how to kick it out. The next domino was right next door, Burkina Faso. Inspired by Mali, the country had 2 coups in 2022. The second one, in September, brought Captain Ibrahim Traore to power. At just 34, Traoré, a charismatic and fiery officer, became the ideological voice of the anti-French Revolution. His speeches, laced with the revolutionary spirit of his hero, Thomas Sankara, captivated millions across the continent. Traoré's words were a direct assault on the neo-colonial order. He didn't pull any punches. He ordered all French forces out of Burkina Faso, suspended French state media like RFI and France 24, and started cozying up to Russia for security help. Along with Mali, Traoré's government became a leading voice calling to ditch the CFA franc, calling it a tool of modern slavery. He became a symbol of a new Africa that refused to be patronized. The message was loud and clear: the age of French paternalism was over. But the most devastating blow came in Niger in July 2023. For France, Niger wasn't just another ally, it was the keystone of its entire Sahel strategy. After getting kicked out of Mali, France had moved its counterterrorism command center to Niamey. Niger hosted a critical French airbase, was a key partner for U.S. drone operations, and most importantly, it was the source of the uranium that fueled France's nuclear industry. Its pro-Western president, Mohamed Bazoum, was supposed to be the last domino left standing. When the military, led by General Abdourahmane Tiani, overthrew Bazoum, Paris panicked. President Macron refused to recognize the junta and tried to use international pressure to force them to back down. It was a disastrous miscalculation. The junta, riding a massive wave of popular, anti-French support, didn't just refuse, they doubled down. They tore up military agreements with France and ordered the French ambassador to get out. When he refused, claiming the junta was illegitimate, it created a tense standoff, with the French embassy essentially besieged by protesters. In the end, France was forced into a humiliating retreat. It had no choice but to pull its ambassador and its 1,500 troops. But the junta wasn't done. In a move that struck at the economic heart of Françafrique, Niger's new leaders went after the country's most valuable resource. In June 2024, they revoked the operating license for the massive Imuraran uranium mine from the French state-owned company Orano. Then, in June 2025, they announced plans to nationalize the operational Somer mine, accusing Orano of illegal and unfair practices. After 50 years of controlling Niger's uranium, France was being stripped of its assets. To add insult to injury, Niger then signed a nuclear cooperation deal with Russia's Rosatom, inviting Moscow to take over the very sector France had dominated for a half-century. Losing Niger wasn't just a strategic defeat. It was a mortal wound to the entire Françafrique system. This wave of defiance wasn't just in military-run states. Even in France's traditionally stable allies, the ground was shifting. In Senegal, long considered Paris's most dependable partner, the 2024 election was won by Bassirou Diomaye Faye, a Pan-Africanist who promised radical change, including renegotiating military-based deals. By July 2025, he had kept his word, and France officially ended its 65-year continuous military presence, handing back its last major bases. President Faye said it plainly. Senegal is a sovereign country, and sovereignty does not accept the presence of military bases. Though done with a handshake instead of a fist, the message was identical. The same mood spread to Chad and Ivory Coast, which both announced the end of long-standing French military presence agreements in late 2024 and early 2025. The dominoes have all fallen. The hidden empire is now in full, undeniable retreat. The collapse of Françafrique isn't just a foreign policy headache for Paris, it marks the end of an era. It's the final, overdue chapter of decolonization, a flat-out rejection of a post-colonial system built for a world that no longer exists. The hidden war, fought for decades with backroom deals, economic pressure, and military threats, is over. France lost because it failed to see that Africa had already changed. The system didn't just die on its own. Its own fatal flaws, the exploitative CFA franc, the lopsided resource deals, created generations of resentment. That simmering anger was lit on fire by France's own blunders, especially the military failure in the Sahel that exposed it as an incompetent protector. Into that void stepped a new cast of global players, Russia, China, Turkey, who gave African nations something they never really had before, a choice. This geopolitical earthquake was supercharged by a demographic revolution, with a young, digitally savvy population using social media to tear down the French narrative and rally behind a new generation of unapologetically sovereign leaders. The fallout from this is huge for both sides. For France, it's an identity crisis. Losing its African sphere of influence is a painful reality check on its diminished status as a world power. French officials have often sounded bitter and confused, complaining about a lack of gratitude, a sentiment that only pours more fuel on the fire in Africa. For Africa, this is a double-edged sword. Kicking out the old colonial master opens up a historic chance to reclaim full sovereignty, build new alliances, and forge a future on its own terms. The new alliance of Sahel states (CES), formed by Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, is a clear sign they're trying to build a new power bloc without Western oversight. But this new era is also full of risks. The French withdrawal has left a security vacuum that jihadists are already exploiting. And the new partnerships with Russia and China aren't charity. They come with their own price tags and strategic demands. The real challenge for African nations will be to avoid swapping one master for another, and to make sure the new deals for mines and security actually benefit their own people. The hidden war for Africa is over because it's not hidden anymore. The competition for influence and resources is now out in the open, a new, messy, multipolar scramble for Africa. France is no longer the gatekeeper, it's just one player among many, and a wounded one at that. The future of the continent won't be decided in Paris. It will be forged in Bamako, Ouagadougou, and Niamey, in the deals signed with Beijing and Moscow, and in the dreams of hundreds of millions of young Africans who have decided their time is now. The empire that never officially ended has now unofficially collapsed. The battle for what comes next has just begun. If you found this breakdown insightful, subscribe for more deep dives into the forces shaking up our world. And let us know what you think in the comments. What does this new era of sovereignty really mean for the future of Africa?